These colors, this letter, and this number is a great driver's car. F10 M5 from 2012 to 2016. Let's open the hood and take a look at the S63 TU.
We got no windows, do we? Do we? No.
Oh, it's all over here. This engine has been torn down for a very specific reason. That wasn't the original intent when we started working on this, but things got out of hand pretty quick, and here we are today. So I figured while this whole engine is apart, there's no better time than to take a look at everything that makes this engine tick. So that said, we're talking about the S63 TU engine today, which is in the F10 M5, F12 F13 M6, and the F06 M6 Gran Coupe. And a lot of what we're talking about today is also going to apply to the N63 TU, which is found in various big chassis BMWs. So I think the first place that we should start off is with the engine block itself. I did say that this engine is related to the N63 TU. Of course, all of the S63 variants are related off of the N63 version, that whatever generation we're talking about, because there's 4 variants of the N63 engine right now, and I think there's 3 variants of the S63. It's an engine that has received constant development since like 2008. But that said, if we look at the front of our block here, normally the timing cover is right here. But the information that you need to see is we got N63/3 here. This is an N63 block. The /3, that's basically just a casting number. And then you have this part number here, 7843360. That's just the part number for this block. If you look up that number on places like eBay or anything else, you're gonna find a whole bunch of N63 engine listings or N63 block listings. The actual block itself is the same between the N63 TU and the S63 TU. The variances are going to be the crankshaft, which is specific to the S63 TU, the pistons, and the front timing cover. Also, the turbo oil line return, and I believe the cooling cover on the back of the engine is also specific to the S63 TU. But past that, like, bore size is the same, everything else is the same on it. Let's start up top here. So the N63 and S63 engines are a hot-vee configuration. That means the turbos sit in the valley between the cylinder heads. So we have all of this heat shielding here, and that is to protect the block. It's to protect a whole bunch of other stuff going on here, but you can already start to see a problem. These are pretty dirty. And then when we take these heat shields away and you look in the valley of the block, it is full of gross, just disgusting material. A lot of oil sludge. The primary problem that you're going to have on these engines is from the turbo oil line return housing or cover leaking over time. That cover bolts the block. It has an integrated seal that can't be replaced, so you have to buy a whole new one. It's pretty crusty and gross. And there is the integrated gasket in the bottom of it. It's paper thin. So it's like a body gasket, and you can't buy it separately, so you have to buy this housing. And these are application specific, so if you happen to have one of these engines, just make sure you're ordering the correct one for your vehicle. But basically, hot turbo oil is coming back, backs up in here, slowly eats away at the seal fails, starts to fill the valley full of oil. There's a weep hole at the back of the block. So I'm gonna take a pick and I'm gonna put it through, and there we go. Picks all the way through. So again, if this valley is filling up with oil, it is going to come out the backside. It's going to drip out of here. It's going to go over the top of the cover that's bolted here. It's going to fall down on top of the rear main seal cover, and then it's going to be pooling down there in the bottom of the bell housing of the transmission, which illustrates the point that you might look at it and think, oh, it's a rear main seal leak, when in reality, it's coming from this area here. So really important to diagnose that properly. In fact, it's such a common misdiagnosis that BMW has an entire service bulletin on how to find sources of leaks on this engine. And again, this is the rear main seal that we took off this engine, and looking at it, if you just see all of this nasty stuff down here, you'd be like, oh, it's a rear main seal leak. But you can actually see where the drips are coming down from above. So you need to be on the lookout for that when you're working on one of these engines and you're dealing with a leak at the back, because if you see oil up here, it's not coming from down there, it's coming from above. And if I were to put this back on, those lines of oil line up really closely to that weep hole. So I think it's almost like BMW knew that oil might be leaking out of the valley. Therefore, weep holes needed to let you know that you have a problem. Another known problem on these engines is this coolant jacket cover. You're gonna see a very similar seal to what was used on that turbo oil line return cover. The weep hole for the oil is right there, comes down here. You can see all evidence of that, but we can also see evidence of a coolant leak. These engines are interesting in the respect that you have multiple coolant lines that go up over the top of the engine to the turbochargers. So you have coolant feed and coolant return going there. You have 4 little soft lines that are known to fail, and then that could also fill the valley full of coolant. If you have the transmission off, if you're doing some engine out repair, you have the transmission separator, whatever's going on, I think it's a really good idea to replace this at the same time because you don't really have a way of knowing when you see this kind of mess, if it is originating from here, if it's originating from above. There are so many areas just within here that leaks could be present that it is worth replacing this part. There is an updated version from All German Auto. I believe they actually supply the part to BMW as part of a service bulletin. It's a billet cover with a better sealing surface. That would be the one to install. It's just one of those things where if you're gonna keep the car for a long time, particularly something like an M5 or an M6, or you just happen to love your N63 TU powered BMW, you wanna look at this part and it does need to be replaced at some point. So just be aware of it. Now, for those of you who may not be familiar with other BMW V8s, the N63 starting in 2008 is a fairly clean sheet design. Has some similarities to the N62 that replaced it, but what this engine does not have is a coolant pipe in the valley. And the reason it doesn't have a coolant pipe in the valley is because there's no room for it. Turbos literally sit right here, so there's no place you can have that. Instead, your coolant jacket is casted into the block, and that's what that cover at the back is for. Here is our front timing cover, and we have a gasket that sits right here. You have a gasket on the outside. This would be for oil. This one is critical because that's what seals off coolant. But the way that this mounts up, and the water pump bolts to the front timing cover there, and it's a mechanical water pump, has a weep hole on it, so if there's ever an issue, you'll know. But that's how all of it will go together. So this engine does have a timing cover, so you can actually access the timing on the engine. And because it has a timing cover, it has a keyed crank with a Woodruff key, and timing is fairly locked on this engine minus the camshafts, which are just bolted on, or the sprockets are bolted on. So BMW did a lot of work on the design of this engine to really strengthen the block. One thing that is easily noticeable are the main caps, which are 6 bolts. So 6 bolt main caps. You have your large bolts that come down through here. You have another smaller bolt that comes down through here. And you have a cross bolt that kind of goes into the meatiest part of the block. So you have a whole bunch of reinforcement happen here. So not only are the sides of the block pulled in, these caps are then pulled down to the top of the block. And this makes it very strong. It's 4.4 liters. In an F10 M5, it makes 560 horsepower, but you know, there's variants of this engine today that are making north of 600. So of course you do have oil squirters in the bottom. So our oil galley kind of goes right across the top. So you have oil-cooled pistons, and obviously those are spraying at the cylinder walls. But the construction of this block, and if you're looking at it, it looks very shiny, right? So it's an aluminum silicone alloy, always referred to as alusil. And the reason why we have this engine apart is cylinder 8 is our problem. It's very textured, and we have a lot of vertical grooves here. You have the block that's cast, and then it's machined. The alusil is then honed, and during the honing process it brings the silicone to the surface, which hardens the cylinder walls. The problem is if you wear through that, you can't really re-hone that. This is to the point where it can't be repaired. So this block is unfortunately junk. I'm going to flip it back up top, and then we can show you what that cylinder liner looks like, what good should look like on a 100,000 mile engine, and what bad looks like on a 100,000 mile engine. Bank 1 is going to be the right cylinder bank, so this is in front of the engine again. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Bank 2 is the left side, and that's 5, 6, 7, 8. So if you look at like cylinder 1, I'm going to shine a flashlight in there. There's a couple of vertical scratches in the cylinder wall, but you know, if you run your finger over it, you can't feel anything. And if we look at cylinder 3, we start to see a little bit more vertical scoring. Now in this engine's case, the reason I think that happened is because of the rod bearing failure that happened on cylinder 8. If we come back here to cylinder 4, which is the companion cylinder to 8, we have a ton of vertical scratching. If I run my finger over it, there is texture in the surface. This is going to be the unloaded side. If you look at the loaded side, and what I mean by loaded side is as the piston comes up and the combustion event happens, one side is going to get a little bit more force than the other. Just you'll see this when I show you the pistons, but the skirts are different sizes, and that's to support the piston. Now, if we come over here to bank 2, very similar story between cylinder 1, 2, I'm sorry, 5, 6. When we get to 7, start to see a little bit more wear. When we get to 8, this is the most amount of wear, and the loaded side of the cylinder wall has quite a bit of damage going on. In fact, there's what appears to be some piston material embedded into it. I'm going to show you the piston from that as well. You can see the cylinder wall for number 1. This is the unloaded side. There's a couple of vertical scratches, but if I run my finger over them, I can't feel them. So to be expected to some degree. If you look at the loaded side, which is over here, there's going to be a little bit more wear on that outside. But again, that's just because when the piston is going down, it's putting more pressure on that outside cylinder wall. So number 1, number 2, number 3, they all have that sort of darker wear mark towards the outside. You're going to see that, and that's totally fine. What's not fine is cylinder 4 right there. That's a lot of wear, and if I run my finger over it, I can actually feel the material of the cylinder wall. And then the inside of the wall has just about the same amount of damage. Now, granted, this is the companion cylinder to the one that had the failure on. But that does make sense because whatever happened at the back of the crank was not pleasant. So we got cylinder 5, looks fantastic. Cylinder 6 looks pretty good. I mean, you do have some wear on the outside there, normal. Cylinder 7, starting to see kind of more of that wear. And then we get to number 8, and number 8 is in very bad shape. Outside here, this is a very interesting surface texture that you don't want to have. And I honestly think if you have one of these engines that suffers a rod bearing problem, you really do need to take a look at the cylinder wall, because I think the piston does get all out of sorts when that happens. I mean, this is also assuming your crankshaft is still in good condition. It probably won't be, but this block is not reusable in this condition. So it's an unfortunate thing. BMW rod bearing failure. It's a story that we all know, unfortunately, too well on a lot of these N-series engines. So, and then just in case you were wondering, we have this little bracket off to the side. Well, this bracket bolts a block, and this is what supports your downpipes from the turbochargers. It's kind of interesting how it goes together, because you have the downpipe that sort of sits in here, and then you have the gasket surface underneath, and the mid-pipe bolts up to it. So I think the other thing I want to talk about here about the block is it is pretty close to being a closed deck. I'd have to look at the actual literature from BMW. Maybe they do refer to it as a closed deck, but to me it's a semi-closed deck. You have a lot of space between the cylinder walls, and then you also have quite a bit of space between the cooling jackets. It is not a true closed deck, but it is pretty close to it. That does help solidify block integrity. I mean, there's a bunch of space up here, bunch of space in between the cylinders. So this is a very strong block. And you know, you can even see like webbing on the outside of the individual cylinders. I mean, they did a lot of work to strengthen the block. You know, even like where your engine mount brackets bolt up, there's a bunch of this webbing and everything. All of that is designed to strengthen the block. It is interesting to see one of these down this far, because normally with the engine out of the car, you can't really see anything on it because it's just covered in everything else that the engine needs in order to run. So I think that covers everything we need to really talk about in regards to the block. So here is our oil pan from the bottom of the engine. It is actually a two-piece. You have the upper and you have our lower. So two rubberized gaskets that can fail and probably will fail at some point during the life of the vehicle. So you get that. However, on these engines, you have an integrated oil filter housing. So unlike all your 6 cylinders and 4 cylinders that have the oil filter housing bolted to the cylinder head or the engine block, depending on what generation of engine we're talking about, you have no gasket here that can leak. So finally, we have an oil filter housing that doesn't leak. So we're going to remove the lower cover, and you have your oil level sensor right there, and a whole bunch of copper, because this thing ate a rod bearing. It's also like the crankshaft girdle, so this is additional stiffening component for the engine block. Oil pump chain comes through here. Oil pump actually mounts directly to the surface here. You do have some oil scavenging that exists in this as well. So this is specific to the S63 TU. Oil that comes down the front can be pulled up out of here and ends up in the main sump. This is a pretty interesting piece. And also your transmission bell housing does bolt to the back side of it. So that's an additional strengthening piece. So this is a very critical strengthening component to the rest of the engine, plus the oil filter housing. In this engine's case, also the oil cooler feed and oil cooler return. Oil pump chain comes from behind. There are reports on the earlier N63s of chain slack happening where you might have to take the lower pan off and then put some tension on the chain. That's not an issue on these engines, so you never have to worry about that. Yeah, and if you're taking the pan off and you feel like there's a lot of tension, it's coming from this side right here. This is where your oil cooler thermostat is. And basically, it is partially spring-loaded. So if you feel that, that's actually normal. But if you notice that one side of it has some tension on it when the screws are coming out, that is just from the oil cooler thermostat. And I'd recommend just put your hand on that side, put some upward pressure on it, and you'll have a much easier time getting the screw out. So we're just talking about the oil pump and everything like that. So I figure let's talk about the oil pump chain and how that works on the crankshaft. It's a single link chain. And right here at the back of the crankshaft, you know, if you're assembling one of these engines, you want to get that on first. Kind of important because it'd be really unfortunate to bolt that down and then realize I never put the oil chain back in. But it just goes off the back of the crank, and that appears to be friction welded on there, but that's part of the crankshaft. Your actual timing components, this is a very simple timing arrangement. Each bank has its own chain, and these chains are pretty robust. You have multiple reinforcements on these chains, so I don't see these really being wear items. Though this is a 100,000 mile engine, plastic guides of course, and these are not really too much wear on these at all. These are in pretty good shape, which is great to see, but this right here would be our tensioning rail, and then this is the guide rail. And again, really good condition. So you have two of those per bank, and those are driven off our sprockets up front here. And those are keyed to the cranks. There actually is a Woodruff key, and you can just basically slide that whole thing right off. Here are your chain tensioners. These get bolted up into the cylinder head. I'll show you later once we get to the cylinder head. But there's an access cover at the front, and these just kind of pop right in and out, so super easy. And then you have your upper chain guides right here, which kind of help take up the slack at the top of the cylinder head. So pretty simple arrangement for the most part. Did mention earlier the gaskets on the timing cover. These are just like metal gaskets. If you ever worked on like a M52 or an M54 engine, that would look very similar. Not really much to talk about on that front. So the crankshaft, like I said, we have a bolt-on, well, not really a bolt-on harmonic balancer. Well, it is. We'll get to that. That's that big old central bolt right there. I'm taking these screws out because here's our front crank pulley. And that front crank pulley is slotted. And it can go this way or that way. There's only one reason that exists, and that's for the AC belt only. Your main belt, main serpentine belt's driven off of this, and it has a tensioner, which you can get slack on. But for the AC belt, instead of using a stretch belt, BMW integrated this sliding arrangement, which was also used on the S55 engine. It's a little goofy. You have to take the bolts out, rotate the engine. Once slack is off, it'll move out of the way. And then when you want to put tension back on it, you move it a different direction. It goes back into the neutral position, you put your bolts back in. Fairly simple, and it's retained by this snap ring. Now, our actual harmonic balancer is bolted with this M18 center bolt. And then that center bolt goes into the crankshaft, and between the harmonic balancer and our timing chain sprocket here, there's an actual Woodruff key on the crank. So this whole timing arrangement's locked. And this entire crankshaft is specific to the S63. It's a forged unit, much stronger than it would be in the N63 TU. These crankshafts are now very difficult to get. This one unfortunately is ruined because of this spun bearing situation here. Really don't know the full history of this car. My understanding is this engine got replacement rod bearings before it got sold. It only appears that it got replacement rod bearings on 7 and 8. And I have a feeling that's because that's where an issue was. It was probably making a knocking noise. They probably threw some rod bearings in it to mask it. And when I run my finger over this, you can literally feel a groove between where the two connecting rods would sit. I don't see any obstruction in the oiling holes, but that doesn't mean that there isn't material that's worked its way up there and blocked off that passage. It's always worth it to blow some air through it, make sure that those passages are clear, because if you have one of these oiling holes that are blocked off, engine's gonna eat itself. And oil pressure in the engine literally comes from the crankshaft. It's the tolerance of the main and rod bearings. Almost think of it like putting your thumb over a garden hose. The less that you cover of that opening, the less pressure you get. Very much a similar thing. You know, oil pump moves volume, but it doesn't pressurize it. It's really the clearances of the engine that do that, and it's coming right from here. It's unfortunate. We do have a solution. One company out there, Lang Racing, they do a modification of these crankshafts where they widen the journals for the rod bearings, and then you can run slightly wider rod bearings, and they also refurbish these crankshafts. We don't sell any of their stuff, but we are going to use one of their crankshafts when we rebuild this engine. So want to throw that out there because there is a solution here. I do think that a problem that this engine has is, look how tiny these rod pins are. There just isn't that much there. And even this discoloration here between these journal surfaces, like that's how tiny these rod bearings are. That's a very small rod bearing. Now, this is the loaded side, and you would traditionally see some wear, but this is actually pretty good. So that's what makes this a little bit more of a mystery, is we don't see a lot of bearing wear in this engine. So I don't really know what caused the problem at the back. I can only speculate that maybe a piece of debris went through the oiling system and it just destroyed one of the rod bearings and it just ate itself from there. But major side skirt wear on piston for cylinder number 8, actually on both sides. But there is some additional damage that we found. So when you're looking right here where our wrist pin goes, you'll see that you have this nice shiny spot. And at first I was like, I don't know what that is, but then I realized, oh my God, the piston hit the crankshaft. So if there's no rod bearing anymore, that's not even touching the journal. I mean, it literally just slams into the crankshaft. Now the crankshaft is harder than the piston, so I could see right here where the witness mark on it is, potentially, almost. But I mean, again, this is a forged crankshaft. It's pretty hard, but it definitely took a hit. And I think that's kind of interesting because normally when you talk about rod bearing wear, you have to be worried about the piston hitting the cylinder head. But in this case, the counterbalances on this crankshaft are so large and the piston or the connecting rod is so short that the piston can actually hit the crankshaft. And I'll grab one that's not beat up like that. I'll take number 6. So if I lay it down, you have maybe a millimeter, maybe 1.5 millimeters of clearance between the counterbalance and the bottom of the piston. So super, super tight tolerances there. And without the main bearing, without the connecting rod bearing, contact will happen. You'll see one side is wider than the other. So the actual skirt here does ride against the wall to a degree. So when you drop these in, right, there is a tolerance there. It's not exactly the size of the wall, but it does touch the wall. And when you hear about like piston slap and everything like that, it's because your rings are super loose and the piston is literally rocking inside the bore. These crowns support the piston in the combustion chamber. So these are literally moving up and down and riding against the cylinder wall. You'll see here, we've got a smaller side and a wider side. The wider side is the loaded side. So what I think happened on this engine that destroyed the cylinder wall is when that connecting rod bearing let go, it actually caused, after the piston hit the crankshaft, caused the piston to go in kind of crooked, and then it just kind of did that up and down the bore and started to wear it away. It's a floating wrist pin, so it's just held in with like 2 snap rings. It is a fractured split rod, so you can kind of see all the texture here on the bottom. That means the other portion, the small end, is unique to the big end, so you can't interchange them. Fracture splitting, you know, they form the rod, they machine it, and then they have a tool that literally breaks them apart. What's great about that is they only go back together one way. It's a super strong, very common design that you see. So when these are bolted together, you can't even see the fracture line. So if you're ever wondering, like, how am I supposed to figure out how it goes back together? Well, number one, keep them together, you know? But like, even if you were to try to do something like that, that's not it. Each one of these is unique, like a fingerprint. And you can literally just feel the two halves go together. It's super cool. And then another thing to look at, so even though we have a lot of carbon here on the pistons, all of our piston rings are still moving freely within the ring seats. Even a little bit of carbon here on the side. But overall, even though you have a lot of carbon on top, you don't have issues with these engines developing so much carbon in the piston ringlet area that you run into this problem where these things just seize up. If you have an engine that happens in, you'll have like massive oil consumption, because particularly your oil control ring, that might be in a compressed state. It can't actually scrape the walls clean. You could have some blow-by too, where your compression rings are not moving freely. These do need to move, and they need to be able to expand freely, and if they can't do that, you're gonna run into a whole bunch of problems. This is pretty typical BMW direct injected Valvetronic type stuff these days. But firstly, let's talk about the aluminum cylinder head cover. This right here is our right bank. So this is the bank 2 cylinder head. These cylinder heads are almost identical with the exception of the oil filler, and then the vacuum pump is driven off of our right cylinder bank, or bank 1. This is the intake. So this is a hot-vee design, so everything's opposite. So instead of the intake being in the valley, that's where the exhaust is. And then our intake is on the outside. And if we look here at our valves, 100,000 miles, these valves are actually not terribly crusty, which is kind of impressive. That's probably the worst one right there. Number 1, 2, 3, 4 on the intake side. That could be potentially leaking valve stem seal. And speaking of which, these engines do have a little bit of an issue with valve stem seals leaking, and that, I think it's just more of an issue of heat, because not only is the engine regulated at a pretty high temperature for efficiency, you also have 2 turbos in between these. That's a lot of heat. But your direct injectors sit down through here, ignition coils there, high pressure fuel pumps mounted there, 2 cam sensors here for intake and exhaust. And that's pretty much all that would attach to the cylinder head cover. But this is generation 3 Valvetronic. The thing that kind of stinks here on these engines is your Valvetronic actuator sits on the outside, intake manifolds here. I couldn't even see this from underneath or barely up top. So that Valvetronic motor is for our eccentric camshaft right here, or eccentric shaft rather. This changes the intake lift of the intake cam, and Valvetronic basically controls everything from idle all the way up to full RPM and everything in between. High pressure fuel pump is driven off the exhaust cam. The unfortunate thing is, if you did have some kind of problem here with the high pressure fuel pump, this is a cam cap, and this is machined to the cylinder head. So if there was damage here, you'd have to replace the cylinder head, which is unfortunate. It's very compact. Everything here is very lightweight for the engine. And actually, if you look at the side profile, you can kind of see how everything just sort of narrows down. That's just for space, which again, hot-vee, putting all of that in that space, you can't have these really huge cylinder heads. We have our VANOS Sprockets, right, which are oil controlled. So you have your VANOS solenoids here, oil chamber that comes up, comes into here, 4 holes feed oil into the 4 holes on the backside, and that will advance the cam position. These are internally spring loaded, and they are side specific. You'll notice that there's a color difference between them. Which one do you think is the exhaust side? Which one do you think is the intake side? This is the exhaust side. And I think that's ironic, because when you buy them new, they look the same. I think this discoloration is just from heat. But again, these are not keyed. They just pretty much sit in the camshaft, and they're bolted in place. Very simple design. So these can kind of just float wherever. And when you lock the engine down for timing, you have the camshafts locked. These can be in any given orientation on the cam. Bolt sets the timing, you're good to go. So you don't have to worry about keyways or anything like that. And everything on these camshafts, at least for the cam sensors, are picked up off the cam right here. So the reluctor ring, or whatever you like to call it, for the camshafts is physically part of the camshaft. Now, this engine did suffer a rod bearing problem. And one thing that you could always do if you suspect a rod bearing issue is, aside from taking the oil filter out and seeing that the oil filter is full of coppery goodness, you can always look at your VANOS solenoids because they have a screen on them. It looks like the oil filter did a good job because there wasn't really much debris picked up into these. There's like some speckly stuff, but I'm not going to worry about that because that can just be washed. But again, your VANOS solenoids just slip into here, and this is what controls oil flow. You can actually see the passages coming up. So oil's fed up into the cylinder head, solenoid moves, allows oil to travel up here, oil comes out of these holes, and that will change the cam position via the sprocket. But this right here is the cam follower for the high pressure fuel pump. What's nice about these, you know, it's on a roller bearing, which is great because you don't have to worry about these things wearing as if it was a flat tappet. And it does have a keyway. So if this thing were to go sideways, it can't go sideways. This is a very generic part. It's used in a whole bunch of BMW DI systems where the high pressure fuel pump is driven by the exhaust cam. But overall, these are, I don't really ever see an issue on those. It is a good idea if you're doing any fuel system maintenance, you know, make sure that, you know, there's even wear here, you don't see any pitting, and make sure that it rotates freely. And then also it has its own lobe on the camshaft. And you can actually see kind of the wear over the time. But now the unique thing, like I said, hot-vee, right? So normally your intake would be here, but it's reversed on this engine. The S63 TU has a very interesting exhaust manifold setup. It is a cross-flow design. So you have 4 pulses, 2 of which are being pulled from opposite banks. And so this would sit in here, obviously it'd be angled, but it bolts like that. And each one of these, you can see it's a twin scroll setup. So we have flow coming from here, flow coming from here. These are hitting at the same time. It's a really cool arrangement. This is specific to the S63 TU. It does help with efficiency, helps with turbo spool. It's part of the reason why these engines make 560 horsepower from the factory. But that is a unique thing, whereas your N63 TUs has 1 manifold per bank, 1 turbo per manifold. It's not that cross-flow design. And then our head gasket. Pretty typical. MLS has this coating on it, 3-layer. These are specific for the S63 TU. These look perfectly fine. We've never had a sealing issue on this engine. So before we do anything else, let's talk about our timing chain tensioner. It's oil fed from the cylinder head, and you have this nice little access hole. All right, these just bolt straight to the cylinder head like so, and then you have this cover up front, which has a gasket. And you just basically take that off, you get access to that, you pin it, you pull it out. The bolts are encapsulated. Somebody in Germany was thinking of everybody else out there when they put that together, because if that bolt fell off, you'd be in for a world of hurt. But yeah, that's where you can get access to the timing chain tensioner. Unique to these engines because on every other BMW, except for some of the B series stuff, your chain tensioner will be on the outside of the cylinder head or timing cover. So that's unique to this engine. All right, let's talk about the high pressure fuel system on this vehicle. It uses these BOSCH HD EV5 injectors, very common. BMW used them for a very long time. Very robust. It's a solenoid style direct injector. However, these engines do have one known problem. These are from bank 2. And if you look at the tips, super clean, came out, no problem. I was able to actually pull them out with my hands. Bank 1, which is the right side, you'll notice that they look a little crustier. And the reason for that is the right bank has a tiny little expansion tank bolted to the cylinder head for the low temp circuit. And what I think happened on this car is somebody spilled a little bit of coolant. It goes into the valve of the cylinder head, and then it just kind of wicks down in towards the tip. However, I have heard instances where a failure of that expansion tank has actually put enough moisture into the electrical connectors that have caused these to basically short open, and then your injector gets stuck open and then it pumps it full of fuel. And fuel is not in a liquid form, is not a compressible substance, so therefore physics happen and you put a nice viewing window in the side of the block. Have heard of that being a problem, so be aware of that low temp expansion tank. That could come back to bite you. If anything, if you could do a relocation, that might be a better idea. But that is a worst case scenario. I don't think that's something that happens that often. But something to be aware of, that these injectors may be really difficult to pull out. I actually had to use a slide hammer on them to get them out. So these are now junk. We have our fuel rails, which are pretty intricate. They bolt to the cylinder head. Each one has its own pressure sensor as part of it. I would say the biggest issue on these is people tend to over tighten these flare nuts. And if you over tighten the flare nut, it's basically a little ball connection in here, right? That just seats with the injector. And then this nut threads together and basically just keeps these two seats together. It's very much like like how a flare nut on a brake line works. People will over tighten these nuts, the nut splits, and then that causes a leak. You do not need to over tighten them. There's no need for that. And then of course we have two high pressure fuel injectors. It's a very common BOSCH design. I showed you on the cylinder head how they mount, and they follow a tappet. One failure potentially, besides your fuel quantity adjustment solenoid, is a failure of the seal, which can cause fuel to leak into the cylinder head. That will then dilute your oil, and then you'll get really crazy fuel trim fault codes. Like, it'll always be rich, and it'll be trying to pull away fuel, so you have negative fuel trims. That's because your crankcase ventilation system is injecting fuel vapor into the intake, which is unaccounted or unmeasured fuel. Haven't seen a ton of those failures on these, but that is the one failure these could have, where it could put fuel into your engine oil. Also, you don't want diluted oil either, so be aware of that. If you see super negative fuel trims and also some pressure related faults, could be a failure of the high pressure fuel pump. And then we have our feed line right here, which quick connect in the engine bay. Each one goes to a fuel rail. This kind of goes up over the top of the engine valley. It's actually right up over the top of the alternator. That's what this is for here. Pretty intricate part, also very expensive. So if you have to remove this, be careful. I mean, that's pretty much the fuel system there, minus your low pressure pump, which is in tank. Here's a problematic component. This is our turbocharger oil feed. This sits directly behind that turbo oil return housing right here. Not much to say on these aside from, if you are replacing a turbocharger and you have seen an issue with like journal wear or something like that, I would be highly suspicious of a restriction in this feed line, because those are oil lubricated. That kind of wear only happens if there's a problem with the feed. So if you're putting new turbos in, please replace the return line, or I'm sorry, the feed line. And also at that point, replace the return lines, because those could also be restricted, causing problems. Moving right along on the other accessories, we have our starter motor. This is in the worst place imaginable, but also there weren't really many other places to put it. It is bolted to the side of the block directly behind the engine mount bracket. So if you need to replace a starter on this engine, you're removing that starter motor bracket, and the positive battery cable is basically tied down to the side of the block under the intake manifold, so it's super difficult to get off. But that's just really kind of the nature of this engine with how it's packaged. Here's our vacuum pump. This is towards the end of BMW's use of vacuum to actuate things. So in this case, we have vacuum actuated wastegates, and we also have a brake booster that's vacuum powered, so this does it all. This is driven off of the camshaft on the bank 1 cylinder head. But this engine has a whole bunch of vacuum solenoids and vacuum lines. Actually, there's a vacuum canister that runs underneath the oil pan. Haven't heard too much about these. These are pretty robust. They are oil lubricated, so you have a little feed that comes in here. I would imagine you would only see a problem on one of these if there was a restriction of oil flow for some reason, which would probably come from really bad oil service intervals. This is also in the back of the engine on that bank 1 cylinder head. I have no idea how you'd even get it out of there. It is very tightly packed in the rear of this. And then got a mechanical water pump. This engine has a whole bunch of electric water pumps on it because of the low temp cooling circuit. But there's really not much to say about these water pumps besides the fact that our thermostat is bolted here. So that's a separate item that bolts. But your main engine cooling circuit, it's just these hoses. That's it. It's not that crazy. The actual engine cooling portion of it for your hot circuit is very simple. It is the low temp circuit that will make you want to go insane because of how it's laid over the front of the engine. I have a photo of this engine when it came out of the car. By the way, very easy to remove the engine, obviously with a lift, but very few parts you have to undo to get one of these out. They've been built and designed to be removed as an entire assembly. There's a weep hole on these for a failed bearing, but past that, I would say if you're doing any kind of work at the front of the engine, serpentine belt replacement, anything like that, take a look at the water pump. And if you see any evidence of coolant leaks, replace it because it is trapped behind a whole bunch of stuff. And this is a shared part with your N63 TUs, so readily available in a bunch of different brands. It's not a genuine only S63 TU specific part. So, oh, you thought we were done. Oh, we're not done. We have a lot more parts in boxes. We just ran out of space here. So right here are our turbocharger coolant lines. And then I mentioned these come right up here to the turbochargers. So you have one of these as a feed, one of these as a return. And the problem on these is because of how close they are to the turbocharger, these little flex lines would break, start leaking coolant into the valley. So BMW has this repair kit, which allows you to put brand new connection pieces on here. But the repair kit comes with the required Eddiker clamps, and overall, I mean, very price effective. It's like 60 bucks, I think, and you can do the job in 20 minutes. There are these little heat insulation jackets that you can essentially clip onto these lines to help provide further protection for these hoses. But that will help provide additional protection for those feed lines. And this is kind of an S63 specific problem. But we do have a kit with both these heat jackets and these repair hose sections available, so you can get it all in one shot. Talk about authentic. Here's our engine wiring harness in a box with both of the water-cooled DMEs. Yes, you've heard that right. Dual, like two, and yes, water-cooled. So these are on the low temp circuit. And honestly, I think that is just strictly because the downpipes are like right there. You have to have some way to cool them off. There's a lot of connections. Everything's kind of pre-molded so it goes back in one way. And that also includes the wiring harness going to the DCT transmission if you happen to have a dual clutch transmission car. So here's one of our charge cooler assemblies. Like I said, the inlet has the throttle body on it. The throttle body is only used to control anything when Valvetronic is not working. Otherwise, this is just wide open. And this is a pretty classic example of you have hot air coming in one side, you have this grid in the middle, which is basically filled with coolant, in, out, air to water heat exchanger. Only thing to be aware of on these is if you did have an internal failure of this, you might start mixing coolant on the intake charge, and then you're gonna start ingesting coolant into the engine. You'll know because you'll have a bunch of white smoke coming out of the exhaust. You don't have a warning or a sensor on the low temp expansion tank, but the electric pumps on that circuit are going to give you a overspeed fault, which would only happen if air is in the system or if there's air pockets, and that can only occur if there's a leak. So just be aware of that. I think that about covers it. The engine mechanically is actually pretty simple. It's everything that sits on top of it that makes this thing daunting to look at and sometimes it's difficult to work on. Unfortunately, this engine block is junk, so I have to source another one. But for the most part, the only issue you're going to run into with this engine is the packaging. And particularly when it's in the car, access to certain components is difficult. So some services do require you to drop the engine out, which is the easiest thing that you're going to do on this engine. They've made that easy. The rest of it around it, wish it was a little bit more simpler. But I hope you learned something. If you have any questions or comments, leave in the comment box below. If you like this video and want to see more like it, hit that like button. And of course, you want to hit subscribe because we'll always have content on the way. And we'll see you for the next one. Thanks for watching. RIP.